To millions of viewers, Little House on the Prairie was more than just a television show. It was a ritual. Families gathered around the screen each week to watch the Ingalls family face hardship and hope with courage and faith. And at the heart of it all stood one woman who seemed to hold everything together, Caroline Ingalls, played by the remarkable Karen Grassle. She was gentle but firm, strong but soft-spoken. She gave advice that felt like scripture, comfort that felt like home. And beside her on that Prairie set was a young actress, Melissa Sue Anderson, who watched Karen's every move with quiet admiration. To her, Grassle was more than a co-star. She was an example of how to carry yourself when the world was watching. But behind the warmth and the family values, something deeper was happening. Karen was navigating the pressures of a male-dominated industry, fighting for respect, for fair pay, for creative space, and doing it all while maintaining that serene public image. Few knew the toll it took. Even fewer understood the distance it created between her and the younger cast who adored her. Now, decades later, at 61, Melissa Sue Anderson has finally spoken, and the truth she tells about Karen Grassle, about the grace, the struggle, and the silence, has left fans rethinking everything they thought they knew about life behind America's most wholesome television family. Because the story of Little House wasn't just about pioneers on the frontier, it was about pioneers in Hollywood, and no one embodied that more than Karen Grassle. Before Little House on the Prairie made her a household name, Karen Grassle was a trained stage actress with no interest in fame. Born in Berkeley in 1942, she grew up with a love of literature and quiet determination. She studied at the University of California and later in London, learning the discipline of classical theater, voice projection, emotional control, subtlety. When she arrived in Los Angeles, she wasn't chasing celebrity, she was simply looking for honest work as an actor. In 1974, the call that would change her life came almost by accident. She was offered an audition for a television pilot based on Laura Ingalls Wilder's books. Karen hadn't read the novels, but she understood the power of family storytelling. When she read for Caroline Ingalls, her calm strength filled the room. Michael Landon, who was producing and starring, knew he'd found the heart of his show. That day, a soft-spoken theater actress became America's frontier mother. From the first episodes, Karen's natural authority shaped the tone of Little House. She didn't play Caroline as a saint, but as a woman holding a fragile family together in a hard world. Her steady voice balanced Landon's intensity, and her stillness gave the show emotional weight. Younger cast members looked to her for guidance, not because she demanded respect, but because she carried herself with quiet dignity. Among those young actors was Melissa Sue Anderson, a teenager still finding her footing in Hollywood. She watched how Karen prepared for every scene, always calm, always ready. Between takes, Karen spoke softly, offering advice about posture, eye contact, and listening, not just acting. To Melissa, she was an example of professionalism, someone who brought theater discipline into the chaos of television production. But behind Karen's composure there was strain. Hollywood expected women to smile, agree, and be grateful. Karen wanted fairness, better writing, and equal pay. She was polite, but she refused to disappear into the background. When contracts were discussed, she asked questions others avoided. When scripts felt shallow, she requested depth. Her quiet persistence earned respect, but it also drew resistance from the show's leadership. Still, Karen never let that tension reach the screen. Week after week, she embodied the strength of Caroline Ingalls, tender to her children, loyal to her husband, resolute in every storm. The audience never saw the exhaustion behind the grace. They saw a mother who could calm fear with a glance. For Melissa, those early years were formative. She saw a woman balancing gentleness and power, learning that strength could exist in silence. Yet she also sensed something Karen never said aloud, that carrying everyone's expectations came at a cost. The young actress admired her deeply, but didn't yet understand the loneliness of being ma to a nation. Only later would Melissa realize how much of Karen's real life had been poured into that role, the weight of responsibility, the quiet endurance, the battle for dignity, in a world that rarely thanked her for it. Because before Little House became legend, Karen Grassle was already fighting for something bigger than fame. She was fighting to be seen. When Little House on the Prairie became a success, millions saw Karen Grassle as the embodiment of goodness. She was the calm in every storm, the voice that brought the family back to center. But off-screen, the woman behind that warmth lived a very different kind of pressure. Karen was balancing fame she never sought with an industry that constantly tested her boundaries. She had spent years building her craft in serious theater, where the work itself mattered more than image. In Hollywood, everything was reversed. She kept her life private, rarely attending parties or chasing publicity. Instead, she studied her scripts, refined her scenes, and arrived on set fully prepared. Her seriousness, while respected, often made her seem distant to castmates who were younger, livelier, and living through the excitement of new fame. Melissa Sue Anderson admired her discipline, but sometimes found her hard to read. Karen's tone was gentle, but her expectations were high. She treated acting like a craft, not a playground, and that intensity could make her seem remote. Behind the scenes, Michael Landon's influence dominated every decision. He wrote, directed, and produced, controlling not only the camera angles but also the tone of the entire series. Karen appreciated his vision yet felt confined by it. As seasons passed, she watched her character's voice shrink while others grew louder. She wanted Caroline Ingalls to face real conflicts, to be more than a symbol of patience. When she raised those ideas, the answers were polite but firm. The creative room belonged to Landon. To the younger actors, those tensions were invisible. They saw Karen's quiet professionalism and assumed peace. But in truth, she was fighting to preserve a sense of dignity in a system that left little room for women to question authority. She didn't rebel loudly, she withdrew, conserving her energy for the work itself. On camera, she radiated kindness. Off camera, she protected herself with silence. Melissa saw glimpses of that restraint. She noticed how Karen carried herself between scenes, always maintaining composure, even when the mood around her changed. Sometimes Karen would sit alone on set, reading or knitting, her face unreadable. For a young co-star, it could feel like distance. Yet that solitude wasn't pride, it was survival. Karen was carving out a small space in a workplace that didn't always feel safe for women who spoke their minds. What no one fully realized then was how heavy that role had become. Karen wasn't just playing America's mother. She was holding together the emotional core of a show led by men, expected to reflect grace no matter the circumstances. And while audiences saw tenderness, the cast saw discipline. Her eyes carried the weight of responsibility. Melissa's later reflections revealed how much she misread those silences. She once said she had mistaken Karen's formality for detachment when, in reality, it was strength disguised as reserve. Karen wasn't distant by choice. She was maintaining control in an environment where too much openness could be used against you. Every smile on screen, every patient glance toward Charles Ingalls, came from a real place of endurance. Karen understood that the women watching at home didn't need perfection. They needed resilience. They needed to see a woman who could endure frustration without losing her center. That became her legacy, a strength so steady that even her co-stars didn't fully recognize it until much later. To the world, she was May Ingalls. To those who worked beside her, she was a quiet study in grace under pressure. Only years later would Melissa Sue Anderson realize that behind Karen's restraint was not distance but courage. The kind that comes from knowing who you are in a world that keeps trying to tell you otherwise. By the late 1970s, Little House on the Prairie had become one of the most beloved shows in America. But behind its wholesome image, The weight of that success was beginning to show. The long filming days, strict schedules, and relentless expectations left little space for personal expression. And for Karen Grassle, the strain of maintaining perfection while feeling increasingly unheard was growing impossible to ignore. She had entered the series believing in its ideals: faith, family, resilience, wanted Caroline Ingalls to reflect those values in complex ways. Yet as the seasons progressed, storylines began to focus more heavily on Michael Landon's character Charles. The scripts for Caroline became simpler, often supporting others rather than revealing her inner life. Karen quietly asked for deeper material, but in a show led by its star producer, creative control was not shared easily. Each request seemed to meet a polite wall. She wasn't confrontational, but her persistence was noticed. On set, she remained composed. She still delivered every line with care, still embodied the mother figure audiences adored. But between takes, a quieter fatigue settled in. The young cast didn't see rebellion, only distance. A woman holding herself together through sheer discipline. Melissa Sue Anderson later recalled that Karen's stillness sometimes felt heavy, as if she carried something she couldn't say. The imbalance went beyond storylines. Karen learned that her pay was lower than that of her male counterparts, despite her central role. Negotiating for fair compensation was considered ungrateful, especially for a woman in the 1970s television industry. When she raised the issue, it caused tension that lingered. Yet Karen refused to let bitterness define her. She returned each day prepared, delivering performances that gave the show its heart, even when she wasn't given the credit she deserved. There were days when her silence was her only defense. She watched younger cast members laugh between scenes while she reviewed lines or rested quietly at the edge of the set. That solitude wasn't arrogance. It was exhaustion disguised as professionalism. She had learned that the only way to survive in that environment was to pour herself into the work and leave the rest untouched. For Melissa, who was still navigating adolescence, it was hard to read. She admired Karen's focus, but couldn't yet understand the emotional price of being a woman surrounded by constant expectations. The distance between them widened, not from conflict, but from unspoken reality. Karen was fighting battles Melissa couldn't yet see, the kind that leave no visible scars, only quiet resilience. Away from the cameras, Karen's advocacy for women's equality was taking shape. She began speaking at small events, encouraging young actresses to value themselves and their voices. She never mentioned Little House directly, but her message was clear: strength doesn't always look loud. It can look like a woman standing calmly on a set full of noise, refusing to lose her dignity. That strength became both her armor and her isolation. By the final years of filming, Karen had learned to give the audience everything and the system nothing extra. She didn't set gossip, didn't set complain, and didn't set break. Yet inside she was weary of being seen only as Ma. The struggle beneath the Prairie wasn't about fame or jealousy. It was about identity, about a woman trained for truth and depth, learning how to survive in a world that valued simplicity and obedience. And though few noticed then, her quiet resistance shaped the very soul of Little House on the Prairie. When Little House on the Prairie ended in the early 1980s, the curtain didn't just close on a beloved series, it closed on a long chapter of Karen Grassle's life. For nearly a decade, she had carried the emotional weight of a role that demanded calmness no matter what storms raged behind the scenes. Once the final scene was filmed and the set dismantled, Karen was left with a question she had ignored for years: who was she without Ma? The years that followed were quieter, but not easy. She returned to the stage, her first artistic home, where scripts demanded honesty rather than simplicity. Yet the transition from television celebrity to theater anonymity was jarring. Audiences still wanted Caroline Ingalls. They called out "Ma" when she appeared at events. The image of that patient pioneer mother had followed her everywhere, blurring the line between character and woman. Karen was grateful for the love but longed to be seen as herself, an actor, an individual, not an icon frozen in time. Hollywood offered few roles that matched her integrity. The industry was shifting toward younger faces, and complex female characters were scarce. So Karen began focusing on teaching and advocacy, speaking to students about artistry, ethics, and the discipline of performance. In classrooms and small theaters, she found something she had missed in television: freedom. No one edited her voice or shaped her lines. She was finally the author of her own story. Meanwhile, the legacy of Little House only grew. Reruns aired constantly, and new generations fell in love with the Ingalls family. The cast was often invited to reunions and retrospectives. Some embraced the spotlight, but Karen kept her distance. Her relationship with fame had changed. She valued peace over attention, truth over nostalgia. That choice, while misunderstood by some fans, revealed her deepest conviction. Legacy means little if you lose yourself preserving it. Melissa Sue Anderson, who had also stepped away from Hollywood, understood that instinct. Though they weren't close after filming, both women had walked parallel paths, leaving behind a world that demanded too much and offered too little in return. When Karen eventually released her memoir, she spoke candidly about the industry's inequities, her clashes with Landon, and the loneliness of being a woman in a man's world. Her honesty surprised fans who had always imagined a perfect set, but to those who truly listened, it was the kind of truth only time could make safe to share. Melissa's response came quietly, years later. In interviews reflecting on her youth, she spoke of Karen with admiration, calling her one of the most composed and prepared actors she had ever known. She didn't dwell on the past, she simply acknowledged that what she once read as formality was actually strength. It was a rare gesture, not dramatic, not sensational, but sincere. Two women who had played mother and daughter on screen had finally reached an understanding beyond scripts or fame. For Karen, that recognition was the closest thing to closure. She had never needed apologies, only understanding. And for Melissa, the act of acknowledging her co-star's resilience was a quiet way of saying what words during filming never allowed, that she finally saw the woman behind the role. The Prairie had long been replaced by city streets and ordinary days, but its spirit lingered. The lessons of endurance, dignity, and faith still guided both women. And though their paths had diverged, the invisible thread between them, forged through years of silence, performance, and shared history, had never fully broken. By the time Melissa Sue Anderson reached 61, enough distance had passed for reflection to feel safe. The years of youth and fame were long behind her, replaced by calm acceptance and a deeper understanding of what those early experiences meant. When she finally spoke about Karen Grassle, her words carried the tone of someone looking backward with clarity instead of judgment. The story she told wasn't one of conflict, but of recognition, the kind that can only come when time has stripped away ego and illusion. She explained that as a teenager, she hadn't understood the quiet strength Karen carried. Back then, she saw only the surface, the calm voice, the measured movements, the air of composure that could feel distant. But now, she realized that behind every controlled gesture was a woman fighting battles that no one else on that set could see. Karen had been balancing creative frustration, financial inequality, and emotional fatigue, yet still managed to embody grace in every frame. That, Melissa admitted, was something she hadn't appreciated until she herself became an adult navigating her own life's storms. In her interviews, Melissa described Karen as the center that held the family together, both on screen and off. She said she now understood how difficult it must have been for an actress to carry the weight of moral perfection week after week, with little room to express her own flaws. Karen's calm wasn't detachment, it was endurance. Her silence wasn't pride, it was self-protection. In a world that demanded women be gentle and grateful, Karen had chosen to be steady and unshakable instead. Fans, hearing Melissa's reflections, felt a shift. For decades, speculation had painted distance between the actresses as coldness, but Melissa's words reframed that distance as respect misunderstood by youth. It became clear that the bond between Mary and Caroline Ingalls had never truly broken. It had simply been hidden under years of misunderstanding and maturity. What remained was admiration, shaped not by sentimentality, but by truth. Karen, too, continued to speak with humility in her later years. She never condemned anyone from her past. She simply explained the pressures that came with being a woman in control of her own worth during an era that didn't encourage it. When asked about the younger cast, she spoke with warmth, expressing pride in the professionalism they showed even as children. Her perspective softened with time, just as Melissa's had. Together, their separate truths formed a single understanding: that every person on that Prairie set had been doing their best to survive the same storm, each in their own way. The truth Melissa finally told wasn't sensational. It was healing. It honored Karen's character, her discipline, and her humanity. It acknowledged that strength can be mistaken for distance, and that love doesn't always show itself in constant affection. Sometimes it reveals itself decades later, in the form of gratitude that finally finds its words. In the end, what Melissa revealed about Karen Grassle was not gossip or grievance, but grace. The recognition that the woman who played her mother on screen had, in many ways, shaped her understanding of womanhood itself. Karen had modeled patience, integrity, and courage without ever needing to explain them. And now, with years behind her and wisdom on her side, Melissa had finally given that example its proper name: truth. For both women, the Prairie never truly disappeared. It lived on in the lessons they left behind: that dignity matters, that silence can hold strength, and that sometimes the most powerful confessions are not about what went wrong, but about finally recognizing what was right all along. Time has a way of softening what once felt sharp. For Karen Grassle and Melissa Sue Anderson, the years turned distance into understanding, and silence into respect. What began as a working relationship between two women at opposite ends of experience had, by quiet evolution, become a lasting example of how truth matures. Karen never chased attention for her hardships. She simply lived with conviction, believing that dignity would speak louder than complaint. Her calm was not passivity but power, the kind that inspired others long after the cameras stopped rolling. And when Melissa finally gave voice to her gratitude, it brought Karen's legacy full circle. The woman once misunderstood for her restraint was finally recognized for her strength. To audiences, they will always be Mary and Ma, faces framed by sunlight and simplicity. Yet beyond those roles lies the deeper story of two artists who found their own kind of peace, one through perseverance, the other through reflection. Their connection was never about perfection, but about grace, a lesson that mirrors the very heart of Little House on the Prairie. Karen Grassle's influence endures not just through reruns but through every actor who learned from her quiet example. And Melissa's honesty ensures that influence will never fade into myth. Together they remind us that truth doesn't always arrive when the world is listening. Sometimes it waits until the noise has faded, until hearts are ready to understand. For more emotional stories, check out this video.